right, I'm going to be talking about the life of Margaret Fuller. Can I just ask how many of you have heard of her before I presented this topic today? Oh, good. Most of you have had some awareness, but maybe not everybody. Bunny and I were talking the other day that she actually they had the UUA sponsored a bicentennial in 2010 and devoted an issue of their UU World to her. Margaret Fuller was the first American to write a book about equality for women, the first editor of the Dial, the foremost transcendental journal, appointed by Ralph Waldo Emerson. She was the first woman to enter Harvard Library to pursue research, the first woman journalist on Horace Greeley's New York Daily Tribune, the first woman literary critic who also set literary standards, and the first woman foreign correspondent and war correspondent to serve under combat conditions. She was born May 23rd, 1810, and died July 19th, 1850, at just 40 years of age. But Susan Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton said that she possessed more influence on the thought of American women than any woman previous to her time. She contributed significantly to the American Renaissance in literature and to mid-19th century reform movements. Her major work, Women in the 19th Century, published in 1845, profoundly affected the women's rights movement, which had its formal beginning at Seneca Falls, New York, 3 years later. And I'm going to share a quote from that. The position I early was enabled to take was one of self-reliance. And were all women as sure of their wants as I was, the result would be the same. But they are so overloaded with precepts and guardians who think that nothing is so much to be dreaded for a woman as originality of thought or character, that their minds are impeded with doubts till they lose their chance of fair, free proportions. The difficulty is to get them to the point from which they shall naturally develop self-respect and learn self-help. Margaret was the firstborn child of Unitarian parents. Her mother's family were Unitarians in Canton, Massachusetts, and her lawyer father served 4 terms in the U.S. Congress and was also elected to the Massachusetts state legislature. 8 daughters and sons were born to the couple, and 6 grew to adulthood. After a younger sister died, Margaret was an only child and the focus of her parents' attention until she was 5. Determined to give his daughter the best possible education, her father taught her himself. I was put at once under a discipline of considerable severity, Margaret remembered, and at the same time had more than ordinarily high standard presented to me. My father thought to gain time by bringing forward the intellect as early as possible. Thus I had tasks given me, with many and various as the hours would allow, and on subjects beyond my age, with the additional disadvantage of reciting to him in the evening. He wrote from his office in Washington, "Tell Margaret I love her if she learns to read." So she did, at age 3. Margaret herself thought the price paid for this early intensive drilling, sometimes late into the night, was sleeplessness and nightmares as a child, and a lifetime of poor eyesight and migraine headaches. Beginning when she was 10, she was sent to finishing schools for more traditional education for women. She had a hard time making friends and was seen as arrogant. From her letters, we know she wanted to fit in with the other girls, but she was awkward and unpopular. She did realize during school that she learned much from talking with others rather than the popular activity of the day, journal writing. She turned out to have a real talent for conversation. In her late teens and 20s, this gift for conversation helped her develop many good friends, including Ralph Waldo Emerson, Nathaniel Hawthorne, Elizabeth Peabody, and William Henry Channing. Her father died unexpectedly, and she had to work as a teacher to help support her family. During that time, in 1839, she began holding a series of conversations at Elizabeth Peabody's bookshop in Boston. Margaret provided a Margaret provided a setting where women could discuss what they knew, be free to explore ideas, and speak their own thoughts on such topics as classic mythology, education, ethics, and the fine arts. Men were included in one evening series, but it was less successful than the women-only sessions. Income from these conversations supported Margaret and her family for 5 years, during which she published her translation of Eckermann's Conversation with Goethe. How do you say that? Goethe, yeah. At Emerson's invitation, Fuller began attending meetings of the Transcendentalist Circle in 1838. And the following year, she agreed to serve as editor of the new Transcendentalist journal, The Dial. Emerson, Alcott, Henry Hedge, Ellen Hooper, Ellery Channing, Henry David Thoreau, Theodore Parker, Elizabeth Peabody, Georgia Sophia Ripley were among its contributors. For almost 3 years, she coaxed articles and poems from reluctant writers, rejected unsuitable material, and wrote much of the Dial's content herself. Gradually, she adopted her inherited faith to her own needs, wishing to be a Christian in full possession of my reasoning powers. She did not reject the church, as did some transcendentalists, but she joined them in finding that nowhere I worship less than in places set apart for that purpose. The blue sky seen above the opposite roof preaches better than any brother. When Emerson took over as editor of the Dial, Fuller contributed her groundbreaking essay, The Great Lawsuit, Man versus Man and Women versus Women, for the July 1843 issue, which she later expanded to become her book, Women in the 19th Century. The book was her major gift to the Times, a manifesto for the women's rights movement. It revealed Fuller's enormous knowledge of literature and philosophy as she described the oppression of the female sex through history and advocated equal status for women. At about the same time, Horace Greeley invited Margaret to write for the New York Tribune. She wrote essays, reviews, and criticism, and they were brought together and published as Papers on Literature and the Arts in 1846. That summer, she sailed for Europe as the newspaper's foreign correspondent. On the eve of the 1848 uprisings in Italy, Austria, and France, Fuller plunged into the turmoil. No longer the outsider she had seemed in New England, she felt at home in Italy, free to express her fullest sense of self. When war broke out, she saw a role for herself either as actor or historian. To her, the revolution meant freedom and human rights for the laboring class and for women. She lived in Rome and sent vivid eyewitness reports to the Tribune. While she was there, she met a handsome 26-year-old nobleman, Giovanni Osili. It's not clear if they ever formally married, but she did have a son whom they named Angelino. With the outbreak of war in Rome itself, his unit of the Guard was actively involved, and Fuller volunteered at a hospital. Although the revolution at first succeeded and a Roman Republic was celebrated, Fuller was right in predicting it would not last. When the Pope was restored to power, the Osilis fled to Florence, where she continued her work on the history of the Italian Revolution. For a time, she thought of remaining in Italy, where they could live inexpensively, and friends urged her to stay. But in May 1850, they sailed for New York. That sailing was tragic. The ship captain died of smallpox. Their baby also caught it but recovered. The inexperienced mate took command after the captain's death and miscalculated his position, was unaware of an approaching hurricane. During the night before the ship's expected landfall, it struck a sandbar within sight of Fire Island and began to break up. The family perished on July 19, 1850. No trace was ever found of Margaret or her husband, but their baby's body was recovered. A memorial to Fuller and Osili, under which Angelino is buried, is in Mount Auburn Cemetery, Cambridge, Massachusetts. The inscription reads in part, "By birth, a child of New England, by adoption, a citizen of Rome. by genius belonging to the world. You know, and I completely forgot to record that. I don't know if anybody else remembered. Harry did? Okay, good. Okay. Let me just finish up with one other quote from, this was a Bicentennial Sermon Award winner by Kathy Lee Crane. In 1836, you met Ralph Waldo Emerson, and he invited you into the Transcendentalist Circle. There you found a religious movement that affirmed the mind, but was so much more than that. It introduced intuition into the mix. It suggested that truth could be revealed through one's own experiences, literally by seeing or hearing or touching, something that moved you to a kind of knowing that was not of the intellect. You'd had such an experience at 21, and you knew firsthand what it meant. In 1839, you introduced your famous conversations. You invited women intellectuals and activists to meet together. Let's face it, you started those conversations because the men wouldn't invite you to join theirs. You wanted friends and intellectual stimulation, and you needed money. Part of the time you were homeless. A woman wasn't allowed to lecture in public, so you called your gatherings conversations, arguing, there's no law about women having a conversation. Frankly, you were self-centered. Emerson quoted you as saying, I know now all the people worth knowing in America, and I find no intellect comparable to my own. You were intense and complicated. They called you idiosyncratic, mercurial, inspiring, alienating, and tormented. Those who knew you acknowledged you to be brutally honest, both about yourself and others. One of your biographers claimed you had an uncanny ability to learn from mistakes and misfortune. She admired your skill and courage in naming your feelings and speaking your mind. You could unblinkingly acknowledge pain. Today, we Unitarian Universalists list many sources of inspiration. One, direct experience of transcending mystery and wonder comes right out of transcendentalism. But it is another where I lovingly ascribe your name, words and deeds of prophetic women and men which challenge us to confront powers and structures of evil with justice, compassion, and the transforming power of love. We're going to end with one final song, and I will screen share the words for that. This is by words are by Samuel Longfellow, and the music is by Thomas William. O life that maketh all things new. Oh, life that maketh all things new, a blooming of our thoughts within, freedom that on faith with I do, gladness hitherto again. From hand to hand the greeting flow, from eye to eye the signals run, from heart to heart the bright hope flows, the seekers of the light are one. One in the freedom of the true, one in the joy of ransom trod, one in those souls that we know you, one in the larger thought of God. The breather sat the polar breath, the wide horizon under view, the sense of life that knows no death, the life that maketh all things new. And the last thing is to join me in the chalice extinguishing reading. if you would, in unison. Because of those who came before, we are. In spite of their failings, we believe. Because of and in spite of the horizons of their vision, we too dream. Let us go remembering to praise, to live in the moment, to love mightily, to bow to the mystery.